we got to break outside of this kind of monolithic vision of theological ministry education. So I started conducting focus group studies. I conducted focus group studies in 4 separate cities with a total of 23 different ministry practitioners. And I put together a series of questions about, their experiences in theological education, what they wish they would have learned, what would they look at if they were hiring a youth pastor today or a pastor today, and all of that. Brought it together, so grounded qualitative research, and that formed the basis of the design of a new program.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast features stories of Canadian church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more, we pray you get inspired to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you are using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode and tuning in. This is technically part of the second season of the Sowers Podcast, but maybe you're joining us for the very first time, and so that doesn't mean very much to you. But officially, this is now the second episode of season 2. Last week, an episode was released with Brady Shearer of Pro Church Tools, and today you're going to hear a conversation that I had with Rob Chartrand. One of the updates in season 2 is that all of these interviews are now available via video. And so if you go to YouTube and search the Sowers Podcast, hit subscribe and follow along, and you'll get updated every single week when a new episode releases. As I said, today you're going to hear a conversation that I had with Rob Chartrand. Rob is in charge of the Christian Ministry Department at Briercrest College and Seminary, and he also co-hosts the podcast Church in the North. I was on this podcast a few months ago, and so Rob is now on the Sowers Podcast, and so I'm excited for you to hear this episode. We talk quite a bit about theological education and the changes that needs to happen in seminaries for theological education to match where we currently are as a culture in our context and for the future. And so I think you're going to be encouraged by this conversation. Please go check out the Church in the North podcast. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Rob Chartrand of Briercrest College and Seminary, and also the Church in the North podcast. Well, Rob, welcome to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for taking the time today to be on this. I was on your podcast, the Church in the North podcast, a little bit ago, and so it's great to now have you here as part of the Sowers.
Thanks, Matt. So good to be here, and so great to have you on Church in the North.
Found it really interesting on your profile page. You have this quote from Lord of the Rings, so I'm going to assume you're a huge Lord of the Rings fan. But you have this quote. It's from Bilbo Baggins, and he says, "It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out of your door. You step into the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there is no knowing where you might be swept off to." Now, I'm assuming you chose this quote. They didn't come up with it for you. Why this quote, and how does this quote represent your own story and even the road that you've been on?
I'm one of those nerds who actually started reading Lord of the Rings when he was very young. A buddy of mine, in my D&D campaign days, gave me a copy of the book. I read it. I was like 12, and I read it like 7 times since then or something like that. So I got it by my bedside right now and rereading it again. But the quote here, I think for me, it speaks to adventure. It speaks to risk in the face of adversity. It speaks to like faith, kind of like Abraham, this sense that God says, go here, and you just go. And so for me, I think it's important to have a posture of listening, a willingness to be open to God's leading. And if that's your life, you'll just never know where God's going to take you. And for me, I mean, I'm an entrepreneurial spirit. On the APEST, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, I'm a high A kind of guy, right? So I'm First Nations background. So my father's First Nations. My mom is like a English Scots woman. And so my wife likes to joke. She's like, yeah, you like to move your teepee every 2 or 3 years. Like you love doing new things. So that's really what it speaks to. It's my life with God has always been that way. So Yeah, that's the best answer I can give.
Now, when you think back to 12 years old, was this a spirit that you always had about you of adventure and starting new things, charting new courses out onto the road, or was this something that developed over time in your journey?
Yeah, no, I think it's probably just part of who I am since the early beginnings. I mean, I was a classic latchkey kid, grew up in the 80s and 90s, wasn't really parented, from a broken home. So, I mean, I basically like lived on the streets kind of thing for the most part, got into lots of trouble. So I think it was there. And then I've just always been a curious person. So I just am always just paying attention and wonder about a lot of different things. So yeah, and obviously it's grown over time. It's been refined. It's been redeemed by Christ and been changed a lot since then. But yeah, so I don't know. Nature, nurture, it's hard. It's hard to know.
Yeah, where are you in the birth order? Do you have siblings?
Yeah, I'm the youngest of seven.
Youngest of seven. Okay. Okay. So maybe that has some influence with it too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so.
How was the gospel sown to you? How did you hear about Christ?
So I didn't grow up in a faith home. I think as a young kid though, I got kind of thrown onto a Sunday school bus. There was a small little Brethren church in the city that convinced my family that it'd be a good idea if I went to Sunday school. So I did that for a few years when I was a kid, and that's where the seeds of the gospel I think were first sown. I mean, I had John 3:16 in my back pocket and I memorized from those Sunday school days, but it really took about a dozen years or more before that actually bore fruit and grew up. And those seeds started to grow up in my soul. And it was really in my grade 12 year of high school that I surrendered my life to Christ. I had Christian kids in my high school that were part of like the choir and musical theater groups and all that I was part of, and they were friends of mine. And so I think they had an influence on me, just seeing the life of Christ in them. But I was in a totally different world from them. I mean, I was like the jock, captain of the football team, basketball team, uh, leading a very corrupt life, and but desperately inside looking for something, looking for meaning. And so I started reading the Bible for myself in high school. And it was really when I got to the Gospels that I encountered the person of Jesus. And uh, more and more, the more I read it, I knew what I needed to do. I needed to surrender my life to Christ. So I wasn't going to church. I wasn't going to a youth group. I wasn't doing any of that. I was just reading the Bible for itself. And then I'd come to passages like, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? What can a man give in exchange for his soul? I'm like, man, that's me, cause I was a top jock. I was a top student. I was successful in every way in my life, but I was deeply broken and deeply empty. And so the person of Jesus, fascinated me and enthralled me and called me in. And that's really how it happened. And I resisted God for a long time, because I didn't want to give up my life. I loved my life. I loved where I was going, my future trajectory and all of that. I wanted to play college football. I wanted to go study medicine. I wanted to make a lot of bank. Like that was my life. And yet I knew somehow that Jesus was pressing on me to surrender all of that to him and follow him in glad obedience with everything. And, that was a real wrestle for me. And then God got a hold of my life. It was actually through a miraculous dream that came about. It's a long story. I won't go into it, but I mean, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was real and he was calling me. And so when that dream came to be, I surrendered my life completely. I gave my life wholly to Christ. I can remember where I was in Moose Jaw. I was under the 4th Avenue Bridge one night, just weighing my life, weighing eternity. And I said, okay, yeah, I'm in, I'm all in. And from that point on, I started following Christ and I gave him my all.
Now, were you part of a youth group, local church at the time, or were these sort of independent experiences with God? I know you said you had some friends that were followers of Jesus that were part of your high school, but what was the environment and the context that surrounding you at that time?
And I'd probably gone to youth group maybe once or twice. So I wouldn't say that was the key factor. It was really mostly independently reading the Gospels and knowing what I need to do. So there was no like sinner's prayer in that moment. Like that wasn't even part of my equation. Like I had no idea how to do that. I just knew full surrender. That's all I knew at that time. And I surrendered my life completely to Christ to follow him with everything. So yeah, and I wasn't going to church, but the night that happened, I was at youth group that night. I got invited on like a hayride with a bunch of Christians out at a farm sort of thing. And so I went and had a fun event with them. But there were all these incidents that happened in that hayride, which were the fulfillment of a dream that I had had like a week prior, like unbelievable fulfillment of a dream. And that's when I knew. And so after that, so yeah, very minimal, I think church influence or youth group influence and maximal Bible influence.
Tell us about your calling story and then your first ministry assignment. Was your coming to Christ moment also part of, oh, I'm going to serve the church? When were those separate instances?
Yeah. And that's the crazy thing is I had a sense that I was called into ministry before I became a follower of Jesus.
Hmm.
And that was the great resistance is I didn't want to do that. I had plans for my life. Rob loves me and he has, wonderful plans for his own life. And so I actually felt a call into ministry. I didn't, I couldn't put it in terms like I would put it today, but it was this sense that if I do this, God's going to put me in places and call me into like a career or some sort that's going to help young people like me, like people who are far from God, who are broken and who need Jesus. And I just resisted that. So the day I surrendered my life to Christ and I was all in, I surrendered my career aspirations and all that. Not that there's anything wrong with playing college football, not that there's anything wrong with studying medicine as a vocational call. I mean, those are all holy callings, right? But I just knew for me, it was a unique, specific calling he was calling me to. So that's where it all began. So then I went off right after that, I went off to a Bible college. It was FGBI at the time, which is now Eston College. It was the only college I knew because I didn't know anything about, ministry training. So even though CBC was down the road in Regina, I had no idea about Canadian Bible College. This is the one I knew because it was connected to the church that my friends were going to, right? So I went to that church and then, oh, well, if you're going to be in ministry, you got to go to Bible college. So I went to that Bible college, did a 2-year diploma. After my 2-year diploma, I realized I wanted to do a bachelor's degree in theology. So I'd learned more. Like when I went to Bible college, I was so green. I didn't know Moses from Abraham, from Paul the Apostle. I didn't know anything, but I was so hungry. So I had a voracious appetite, read the word of God because I felt like I'd lost 18 years of my life and I was so far behind and I needed to catch up. So after those 2 years, and I started my degree at Canadian Bible College, I switched there because I was done at the other school. A church took me on, and that was the church that I actually started attending. It was Hillcrest Church in Moose Jaw, and the lead pastor had just started there. His name was Alan Buchanan, and I wrote him a letter after my second year, and I said, "I believe God wants me to be your youth pastor." And he said, "Well, step into my office when you get back and we'll have a conversation." And he took me on, he took me under his wing and he mentored me for 5 years, which is so great. And so I completed my first theological degree while I was in ministry. I started being a pastor after being a follower of Jesus after 2 years. So since then, I've been in ministry ever since.
Wow. Wow. And so tell us the journey. I know at some point you end up in southwestern Ontario in Markham, and then you end up back in Edmonton. So did you go from Moose Jaw to Markham back to Edmonton, or tell us a little bit of that journey?
It's a convoluted and long journey, but I had a number of different ministry stopovers along the way. A couple of tough church leadership experiences in toxic or just difficult environments. So I was in Moose Jaw for 5 years, and I was in Regina for 3 years pastoring there. I went from there to Thunder Bay, Ontario for a couple of years. And at that point, I switched into the Christian Missionary Alliance for that. Then I was in Markham for 4, and then back all the way to Edmonton for 16 years. 4 of those years, I was at Beulah Alliance as the executive pastor. And then out of Beulah, we planted Crosspoint Church, and I served there faithfully for 12 years. So most of my roles were youth ministry, young adult related, but I did have some associate roles. So I did a little bit of small groups, a little bit of worship in Regina, but for most of it was in youth ministry until I got to Edmonton, where I was at Beulah, and I was the exec pastor there.
Now, Beulah is a very large church. When you came on staff there, were you already thinking about planting out of Beulah, or when did that journey begin in your staff time at Beulah?
Yeah, it was actually in Regina. Like when I was in Regina, this is, I went to Canadian Bible College and then went to Canadian Theological Seminary, which were alliance schools. And I was in the Apostolic Church and loved my apostolic tribe, loved the people there, loved working there. But it was really at that time that I started to have this sense, and it was like in my late 20s, that one day I might plant a church, like God might call me to plant a church. And so I investigating the alliance and really becoming more and more alliance in my thinking and in my theology and whatnot, I realized that they were a great denomination that helps missionaries and that helps church planters get started. And they really had a vision for it. And so that's when and then theologically, I was just more aligned with them. So then I became Alliance. I joined the Alliance denomination, was ordained with them as well. So it was in my 20s that really that vision came about. But it wasn't until I got back to Beulah, like it kind of stayed dormant for many years. It wasn't until I got back to Beulah that it began to get spark and life again. And where it really ignited was Beulah. We at the time when I was there as the exec, we were looking at multi-site campus. We were beginning to investigate what it would look like. That we made plans to do our first multi-site campus. And so I was going down to a lot of conferences stateside on multi-campus and church planting. And God just started stoking the fire of church planting again in my heart while I was down there. So eventually I came to our lead pastor and I said, I really think, I know this isn't in our vision as a church. Like we're about multi-site. We're not about church planting, but I really think God is putting it in my heart to plant a church. And as Keith Taylor, I know he swallowed, it was a big gulp because I was a member of the team and doing a great job and we worked so well together. And so I know as a leader, that would have been a hard thing to consider, but he considered it prayerfully, brought it before the elders. Our district got involved and all that. And then they, after, praying about it, they said, yeah, we need to do this. We need to get behind you and get behind the launch of a new expression of church in Northeast Edmonton.
So give us a little picture of Crosspoint Church and your time there, maybe 2 or 3 highlights.
Yeah, Crosspoint, man, we launched prematurely. Once I announced to Beulah that we wanted to launch, our philosophy was long goodbyes or painful goodbyes. So if a staff member is ready to leave, let's get them going. And really, I started officially with Crosspoint, leading it in the month of April part-time and May full-time, and I had to launch it by September. So you can imagine trying to launch a church, and Beulah gave us a great budget and whatnot to get going, and we had to start working on getting people during the summertime in Edmonton. Like in the summertime in Edmonton, everybody's heading for campsites. They're disappearing, right? So we launched in September. And we did it like a 5 weeks pre-launch, and then we did a public launch in October, and we only had a 4-month runway. I would never do it that way again because that first year was really a year of experimentation. But if I could describe the ethos of Crosspoint, I would say it's missional, it's externally focused, and it's multi-ethnic because we were planting in a part of the city that we knew had tremendous ethnic diversity. But also a part of the city that was kind of a broken postage stamp. So we wanted to make sure that we were focused on, we didn't just want to create an attractional church, that we were inviting people to come and show up and come from far away and, kind of a regional experience. There were other parts of the city we could have planted if we wanted to do that, like suburbs and whatnot. And we could have done like the pop-up life church kind of model expression and Sunday morning attraction. But we knew for us, it was going to be a long obedience, and it was going to be about loving people in very tangible, practical ways, and establishing like missional small groups in different parts of the city where people could be the hands and feet and voice of Jesus. So that's really what it's about. We were portable for 8 years. And finally, we were gifted a building from our denomination. There was another church, an Alliance church, just down the road that was closing its doors. And so we worked with that church when they closed. We said to our district, well, we don't want to merge churches because we have a really healthy DNA and their DNA has been failing. But what we'll do is if we take on the building, we'll invite that church, which is about 40, 50 members, seniors, to just come and be part of our church with our strong missional DNA. And they did. and they were wonderful, and they were wonderful people, because our congregation was very, very young. Their congregation was obviously, much, much older. It was just such a beautiful merger that took place, and they became part of Crosspoint Church. So Crosspoint was there for about 4 years in a building in a broken postal code, which is great, because before it was all pop-up, it was all portable. We're renting community things, and so we weren't really a visible, tangible expression of the gospel through a building. But once we got that new building, there was so much more that we could do. I'll tell you one thing that happened though. In our first year and a half at Crosspoint, the building we were in a seniors center, but think of it not like a seniors home, but like it's got like a gymnasium and cafeteria and all that amazing senior center. A year and a half into that building, the building collapsed. We had a record snowfall in Moose Jaw, and the building started shaking. We weren't in the building. It happened on a Monday, not a Sunday, but the building collapsed, and we had no building. So like as a church plant, we're like, where do we go? We got nowhere to go, right? And so I can remember sitting in my living room, myself and my 3 or 4 staff members on phones, calling everyone in the church. This is where we're going to meet on this given Sunday. And then we lost the building for we were in different places for about 3 weeks. Finally, we landed in a junior high school. We were there for about a year and a half until they rebuilt the senior center. And then the senior center welcomed us back because we were such good tenants, and we were there for many, many years. So Lots of adventure in the church plant.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Rob Chartrand in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Briercrest College and Seminary. The rapidly changing global landscape is causing significant anxiety in today's young adults, leaving them uncertain about their future prospects. Briercrest's mission is to help youth navigate the transition to adulthood through an education that disciples. Briercrest provides a vibrant and inspiring environment for students to build a spiritual foundation that will equip them for lives of service in both the church and the marketplace. Here, students will gain valuable knowledge and practical skills that prepare them to impact a changing world. If you want to learn more about Briercrest and an education that disciples, you can visit briercrest.ca. That is BRIERCREST.ca. And now back to my interview with Rob. And then in 2022, which is sort of just after COVID, you transition to Briercrest after 12 years in your plant. So on the podcast that I was on with you for Church in the North, we talked a bit about my transition, but when did you know it was time for you to transition from Crosspoint and to take on this new role that you're in Briercrest?
So I started getting a stirring in my heart pre-COVID. And that was with my wife, Karen, as well. She was sensing the same thing. As we'd grown Crosspoint to a place where it was healthy. They were in a building. They had good staff, amazing staff. They had a very strong, healthy elders board. These were all the things when I first planted Crosspoint. I was like, these are the things we want to see in place. This is the goal. We want to build a church and grow a church that's going to outlive its founder. That's really what we wanted. And we were there. And I started to just get a stirring in my heart that stay here. We're not going to be here forever. And so we were actually really close to landing a new role in another church. Like there was actually a handshake agreement that we were going to go and work in another expression, another ministry. And I remember I was at dinner with the person who I was, we were making this agreement with, and they said, we'll send you the documentation on Monday, and then you can sign off. And then we would just go through the transition plan with our own church. And my elders knew this was happening at the time and whatnot. Well, what happened on that Monday is the world shut down because of COVID. So the paperwork never got sent. And we knew at that time, like the worst thing we could do for our church right now while they're in a time of crisis is to walk away. And so we said, no, as we prayed, we're like, no, we're here to stay. We're here to stay. And really, God really changed our hearts there for a season. I don't know why why it happened, but we all started to feel like maybe we'll retire with Crosspoint. Like maybe we'll be here forever. But about a year and into COVID, as things started opening up, we again started to sense this stirring in our hearts. And I won't get into the details, but really that led us to say, well, what's next, God? What do you have next for us? And that was really the beginning of the next steps towards ending up at Briercrest.
Now, did Crosspoint, or was it difficult for your elders, maybe because it was a little bit of a shock that COVID had shut things down, that they could kind of bring you back into the circle again? Because you've kind of already said, "Hey guys, I'm leaving." How much of the church knew about that? Was that a difficult season?
The staff didn't know, only the elders knew. And yeah, like when I was moving on, I mean, it's like when we made the announcement, I was crying, they were crying, like it was like, oh man, we're losing Rob, so when I said, oh no, it's not, we're here to stay, I think there was a sigh of relief, but then there was always this sense probably that this is still tentative, like is he here for good, and all I could say was, I have no plans of going anywhere. Like I feel like I'm here for good, or until God says otherwise, right? So um, and then when it happened again, I mean, it was like, oh, okay, well, I think some people were like, I kind of thought it would happen again, that sort of a thing.
So you end up transitioning to Briercrest then, and you now serve as a professor and coordinator for Christian ministry. So what does this mean? And then what are some of the trends and changes in Christian ministry education over the last 20 or so years, as now you're serving and I'm sure giving some leadership to what it could look like in the future?
Yeah. So my role in the department, the Christian ministry department is the department that's responsible for the shaping of ministry leaders, future ministry leaders. So youth ministry, worship ministry, pastoral ministry, children's ministry, all of that is within my department. And we have a number of different concentrations that students can take. Now, someone can take a biblical studies degree and still go into pastoral ministry, right? And somebody can take a music degree and still go into worship arts, but ours is primarily focused on ministry leaders. If you want to get into ministry, that's ours, and ours has internships involved as well. So that's the department I've taken on. And, in terms of changes in the last 20 years, man, what are the trends in Christian ministry education? Sadly, I would say not much. And this comes from investigation even across the country, but I can only, I can speak generally about what I'm seeing across the country, but I can speak more specifically about Briercrest. The program hasn't changed much in 20 years. Meanwhile, the world has changed. And so I think the academy has been far behind. And most church leaders will say that. I knew this before coming into the academy is that, Christian ministry preparation programs and colleges and universities or whatnot are not creating the types of leaders we need for the church of now and the church of the future. I mean, and really that's part of the reason why I came to Briercrest, is I wanted to be on the other side of that, helping, and to see kind of a marrying of the church and the academy coming together. So there's been tweaks along the way, but in terms of an overall change, that has not happened. Now we're starting to see more and more changes. We're seeing like the rise of co-vocational ministry. We're seeing the rise of more competency-based type of ministry preparation that's taking place. But really the world is changing. The world has changed, but the academy is just catching up.
So what do you think the training will look like in the future? Like, as you said, there hasn't been a lot of change over the last number of years, which you're sad about. You're now in a role where you have the opportunity to shape what this training could look like in the future. What do you think the training should look like in preparing individuals for vocational pastoral ministry?
At Briercrest, we've just gone through what's called a strategic program review, and you're supposed to do that every 7 years. And so as part of our program review, what they do is they like survey current students, previous students. They talk to other schools and what they're doing, right? But I thought that the process of the program review seemed very insular, seemed very focused on ourselves and what we've been doing and whether we've been doing it successfully, and then looking at other schools. But if all schools are doing the same things, then what you really have is this circular reasoning that's taking place. And for me, I'm like, we got to break outside of this kind of monolithic vision of theological ministry education. So I started conducting focus group studies. I conducted focus group studies in 4 separate cities with a total of 23 different ministry practitioners. And I put together a series of questions about, their experiences in theological education, what they wish they would have learned, what would they look at if they were hiring a youth pastor today or a pastor today, and all of that. Brought it together. So grounded qualitative research, and that formed the basis of the design of a new program. Now, coming into this I could have probably told you 95% of what the findings would have been anyway, right? But I needed hard data to convince the academy and to convince what we call a Senate here, which is all of our faculty, that these are the changes that need to happen. So we've redesigned the program. So I say all that to say, I mean, we're trying to listen to what's happening. So what would be different? I think there are a lot of practical things that pastors don't know when they start that they need to know. Things like, primarily how groups, teams, and volunteers. How do you onboard? How do you care for that whole Ephesians 4:11 ministry? A lot of schools don't teach that. I think we have challenges with resiliency. And so we need to really focus on spiritual formation, and not just a 100 level class, but spiritual formation for ministry. How do you build a trellis that your life can live on as a pastor, going forward? I think it needs to be grounded in practical ministry. And so we've created an extensive internship with really clear metrics and rubrics of what that needs to happen with local churches. I think the church of the future is global. And so, especially in Canada, we are living in a multi-ethnic context, whereas a lot of our ministry models are pretty monolithic and pretty European Western. And so we need to look at this with different sets of eyes in terms of how we do ministry cross-culturally, not just overseas, but actually here in Canada. What does a multi-ethnic church look like? I think we have to rethink and reposture how we do mission and evangelism. So a lot of our evangelistic models are very attractional, kind of come and see. And so how do we empower the people of God to be the people of God on mission in the world? So how do we practice our sentness? I think we need a better, more robust theology of mission. And then I think we need to address the new realities for churches that cannot support pastors. So co-vocational models, multi-site models, missional church models, neighboring models, all of those sorts of things we need to start thinking about as we prepare a new generation of pastors. And then it goes without saying, I mean, we need to help pastors know how to speak to the culture, to contextualize the gospel in a culture that is post-Christian, post-modern, post-Christendom, post-everything, really. And, we see the rise of critical theory. We see the rise of new apologetics. And so I think pastors need to be prepared to address some of those needs, and at all levels, not just senior pastors, but youth pastors as well, because they're at the coalface of it all. So,
yeah, when you were in those focus groups, what were some of the barriers that people were talking about that are coming from everyday people saying, hey, here are the barriers today to people pursuing Christian ministry assignments, pastoral work?
yeah, I think so. If we're talking about a younger generation, I think there's obviously the monetary barriers, like the finances, right? That's a big thing. Like how theological education, Christian education costs more. It just does, no matter what. If you go to a Christian university or Christian college, it's going to cost more. And the reason why is it's not government subsidized. So they rely on student tuitions and donations. And for that reason, they have to bump up tuitions to make it work. So pastors are going into something where their education costs more. They're coming out and they're working a job where they're going to make less, right? So some of them coming out with $40,000, $60,000 in student loans, going to work in a church, and they're making just above minimum wage. Well, that's a challenge, right? So, that's one reason. I think, the pool of young people pursuing ministry is smaller because we see culturally the rise of the nuns and duns. We see young people stepping away from their faith more and more when they graduate from high school and start going to college, university. So the pool is smaller. But I'll tell you the reason why the biggest barrier, and it's related to the finance thing, is the biggest barrier is we we've changed our imagination, our moral imagination culturally. Um, and because we've done that culturally, it's affected the church as well. So we have this tidal wave of cultural thought that is pressing on us as a church. And that is affecting adversely the reason why young men and women are going into ministry. Our moral imagination has changed in the sense that we no longer see fidelity or faithfulness to God as our highest good in the church.
Hmm.
We see happiness as our highest good in the church. So it's a hedonism, but it's a very subtle hedonism. I mean, if you were to ask a parent, what do you want for your young person? What do you hope for them in life? And most parents would say, I want my kids to be happy. I want them to be secure. I want them to have a good job. I want them to have a good life, basically. Most parents would say that. Very, very few parents top of mind would say, I want my child to just be faithful to God. That's what I want for my child, right? And this hedonism, so our moral imagination has changed. We see faith as not the aim, but we see faith as an asset. So we see faith as an asset towards our ultimate aim, which is happiness, right? So if I can leverage my faith to get me to happiness, great. The problem with happiness is it's elusive. We know that, right? I mean, happiness is always a byproduct of something else. And if you shoot for happiness, you will never get it. But if you shoot for faith in God, you will get happiness. But we've confused it. But here's how it's manifested. It's manifested in two ways with parents, particularly parents when they're thinking with their kids, what's your future? What do they want for their kids? They want their kids to be safe and they want their kids to be secure.
Hmm.
So safetyism is on the rise. John Lukinoff and Haidt talk about this. So we bubble wrap our kids. We put them in hockey helmets just, so they can go in the backyard and play duck, duck, goose, lest they hurt themselves, right? And so we cocoon our children, and because we want them to be safe. And that's a high value for us. It's almost a sacred value for parents and their kids, but they also want them to be secure, right? So they want them to have a good career. They want them to have a good life, right? They want to make sure that they are prepared, and parents feel responsible to prepare their kids in the best way. But here's the challenge with safety and security. Safety and security, if those are our two highest and sacred values in our parenting and in our churches, can be antithetical to the gospel and can be antithetical to mission and ministry. I mean, pastoral ministry is not always safe, right? And pastoral ministry is not always secure. But if we have these are our highest values, then that's a problem. So my contention is we've got to call young men and women. We've got to call our churches to really fully commit themselves and surrender their lives to Jesus of the gospel, right? And a gospel that is a full gospel where Jesus is the resurrected King and Lord of all, ascended to the Father. And if that's true, then we will say, whatever you want me to do, I will do it. I'll fully surrender. Well, if you know my story, I mean, that's my story. I'm willing to give up it all to follow Jesus and be broke. That's okay. But I really think that's at the heart of why fewer young men and women are going into ministry.
So Rob, I'm wondering if you could encourage the pastor or the parent that's listening to this. Where do they start with this vision of discipleship that's maybe deeper than where they are? They're fearful of losing relationship with their child, but where would you encourage them to begin?
Well, I think the starting point is with the gospel. It's with understanding the gospel and believing the gospel and living in the gospel. And when I say the gospel, not to be confused with kind of like a soterion salvific gospel, where it's easy believe grace and kind of a salvation plan understanding of the gospel. I mean the more robust King Jesus gospel, that Jesus is not just a savior who died on the cross to manage my sin problem, but Jesus is in fact also the resurrected Lord of all, King of kings and Lord of lords. And Tim Keller, I mean, he would say that, you probably have heard this quote before, but if Jesus is in fact the resurrected Lord of all, then the implications of that truth are far reaching. We should fall upon our knees and say, command me. And so as you understand the gospel, I mean, and live in the gospel, it should transform the way you live. And so I think that churches, pastors, need to be preaching the gospel to themselves, preaching the gospel to their congregations. And I think that's true for parents as well, is to live in the gospel. I think our culture is giving us many different narratives, many different stories. We need to tell a better story. And the better story is the story of Jesus, the resurrected King. And so the implications of that truth, again, they are far reaching. The evidence that's out there, if you were to read Kara Powell's Growing Young, if you were to read Faith for Exiles, Kinnaman, even my own doctoral research, it all demonstrates and points to the fact that churches that fail to preach the gospel and call young people to a life of surrender will see their young people eventually depart. I mean, Christian Smith outlined this when he understood he first coined the term moralistic therapeutic deism. If you soft pedal the gospel, if you create like a gospel that's kind of halfway there, or a gospel that's easy to follow, young people will walk away, because it's no different selling them. It's absolutely no different. And we fear that if we call young people to surrender their lives to Jesus, that they'll walk away. But the opposite is actually true, that if we call young people to a robust gospel that calls them to come and die, they will actually follow. They will follow more faithfully for life. So for me, I think it's preach, understand, live in the gospel. Second, to actually call young people to live in that gospel, but you can't do it unless you're doing it ultimately yourself. And then thirdly, I think I would follow Kara Powell's truth and just say you have to invest in young people, invite them into leadership, give them the keys to the kingdom, find ways for them to be part of the body of Christ now, to exercise their gifts, to discover what those gifts are.
Rob, just in closing, I'm thinking broadly about Canada. You've done lots of research, you've had focus groups, your doctoral work. What and where do you believe are the opportunities for gospel sowing in Canada today?
The opportunities are outside your door. They are absolutely everywhere. And I think it's important that believers understand who they are, that they are the sent people of God. They are the people of God, called by God, on mission in the world. And as the sent people of God, he calls us to be his hands and his feet and his voice everywhere we go. And if we understand this truth as our identity as believers in Christ, as the sent people of God, then that should lead to a radical reorientation of our lives around the gospel and around mission. So people are far from God the moment you walk outside your door. And the goal isn't to get them into church. The goal is to extract the church into the world, not to attract people to a church. So where you work, where you shop, where you recreate, where you live, I think these are things that you, Matt, say all the time, is where the people of, where the mission field is. The moment you step outside your door, the moment you step out onto the road, right? So build relationships with people far from God. Be intentional in how you build those relationships. Be willing and surrender to God, in willing to share the gospel and to do it courageously, but really connect. And so for us, I mean, I'll give you an example. We decided we were not going to live in Cairnport, Saskatchewan, Karen and I. So Briercrest, for those who don't know, is 15 kilometers outside of Moose Jaw in a small town called Cairnport. And it's a beautiful community. I mean, they're almost all Christians there. They all work together. They all live together in community. And as a church planter and a hobby horse missiologist, I would say that would be anathema to me, is to be surrounded by Christians all day long. And so we intentionally decided we were going to live in Moose Jaw. And the reason why we wanted to be in Moose Jaw is because we didn't want to be surrounded by Christians all the time in this oasis, but we actually wanted to be where lost people are, so that we could be the hands and feet and voice of Jesus. Now, have we done that successfully? Well, we're getting better. We're growing into it as we get to know our neighbors and as I get involved in different social groups in the city. But it's about being intentional. And so for us, it's like, well, God intentionally plant us in a neighborhood in Moose Jaw where we can build relationships with people far from God.
Well, friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is much from this conversation with Rob that could be applied as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is one, the inspiration that there are people thinking through the future of theological education and wanting to make changes. And so if you're somebody that is in pastoral ministry, yet you feel like you want to grow in theological education, be encouraged. It sounds like there are changes coming that will hopefully assist you in your pursuit of theological education. The other thing that I want to focus on, however, is when our brother Rob just really called out all of us as it relates to the gospel. Are we believing a false gospel, a good news that we've made up in our own mind? Or are we following the King Jesus gospel, making him King, Savior, and Lord of our lives? Sometimes we need these reminders and these opportunities to be called out and say, who are you worshiping? Whose image are you worshiping? And is it King Jesus? And so I'd simply invite you to reflect on that as you leave and as you stop listening to this podcast, and hopefully spend some time meditating on what you've heard later on today. Well, friends, thanks again for joining us for this episode. I'm now going to leave you with a clip from next week's episode with Keith Dow of Charis Disability Services. Is there a more robust, firmer definition around disability in those that you would serve?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you're right in terms of the cultural moment that we find ourselves in. Not only what the definition of disability is, but how do people relate to that, right? It can be all too easy to break that word apart and focus on the disability, right? The almost negative connotations of that. But we've been doing that for far too long. And so there's a real effort to reclaim that word among disability advocates to say it's a part of life, it's a part of who we are, it's a part of human embodiment to experience disabilities at time. And we know that most people will experience disabilities at some point of time in their life.